My name is Joanna Reed. I am 32 years old. I hold the rank of Major in the United States Army. My career has taken me to places most people only encounter through television news. I have endured sandstorms so dense you couldn't make out the person standing right beside you. I have walked through crowded markets where a single misplaced look could get you shadowed. I have been present in rooms where a decision reached in complete silence kept people breathing. None of it carried any weight with my father. Not in his world. "You're nothing but a lowly soldier," he said, his voice smooth and faintly amused, cutting easily through the low murmur of surrounding conversation. The laughter that traveled around the long mahogany table was restrained, but it landed all the same. He reclined in his leather chair, swirling amber scotch as though the glass itself were an extension of his authority. The men and women gathered here were his kind of company, corporate titans, politicians, the sort of players who sealed deals over dessert. I held my expression still. Years in uniform had taught me that silence carries more force than any response. My hand rested lightly against the linen tablecloth as I took in the chime of crystal glasses and the scrape of silverware against fine porcelain. Then I noticed him. He was positioned near the service entrance, half swallowed by shadow, wearing a suit that did nothing to conceal the tension wound through his posture. I recognized that face without hesitation. 2 years earlier in Kabul, his image had appeared in a classified briefing. A contract assassin with confirmed kills across 3 countries, vanished without a trace. And now here he stood, 30 feet away, sweeping the room with eyes that registered everything. I followed his gaze to its target. 2 seats from my father, deep in animated exchange with a U.S. Senator, sat General Marcus Hale. 4 stars, Army Chief of Staff, a man who had commanded thousands and whose word could reposition entire units across continents. The assassin wasn't here for conversation. My pulse jumped, but training took command. I dropped my eyes to my lap, eased my phone from my clutch, and opened a secure line known to exactly 3 people. Marcus Hale was one of them. My thumbs moved without hesitation. "Get up and leave now. Don't ask why." I sent it. Across the table, Hale paused mid-sentence. He reached for his phone with a composure that appeared entirely rehearsed, glanced at the screen, then let his eyes rise to meet mine. The contact lasted less than a heartbeat. Then he stood from his chair. "Senator, let's continue this tomorrow," he said, his voice so measured that no one around him stirred. He moved away from the table, his aides nowhere visible. My father's fork froze halfway to his mouth. "What?" He never completed the thought. The assassin peeled away from the wall, tracking Hale toward the exit. That was the moment the 2 aides materialized, seemingly from nowhere, positioning themselves to intercept. The exchange was silent, precise, a choreography I had witnessed before in places where no one else understood what was unfolding until it was already over. The table hummed with ongoing talk of market trends and lobbying strategies. My father stared after the departing figures, his lips pressing into a firm line. I returned my attention to my plate, the flavor of restraint entirely familiar. He had no idea what I had just done. He had no idea that the daughter he had dismissed as lowly had just prevented something that would have shattered that room and sent tremors far beyond its walls. And for the moment, I was content to leave it that way. The morning air was cool, carrying that faint edge that bites, even through the steam rising from a coffee mug. I was standing on the front porch of my apartment, watching the street come alive when the pounding started. Not a neighbor's polite tap, the kind of knock that carries authority behind it. I didn't need to check my phone to know where they were headed. By the time I arrived at my father's estate, black SUVs were lined along the driveway. Men and women in dark jackets moved with sharp precision through the front entrance. Radios clipped to their collars. The gold crest on their shoulders caught the early light. Interpol. I stepped inside without announcing myself. My father stood in the foyer, still in his robe, hair disheveled, confusion twisting his face into something unfamiliar. "What is this? What is happening?" he demanded, but his voice lacked its usual authority. The lead agent approached, a folder tucked beneath his arm. Without a word, he drew a photograph from a plastic sleeve and held it up between two fingers. I watched the color drain from my father's face. His eyes locked on the image as though staring long enough might alter it. It was him clasping hands with the man from the previous night, the assassin. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. His gaze flickered to me for the briefest fraction of a second. An unspoken question, an accusation, and something else I couldn't name, all tangled together at once. The agent's tone was neutral and professional. "We have more, but I believe this is sufficient for now." Around us, drawers slid open and shut. Boxes were carried out. The controlled, methodical energy of a well-executed operation. I lifted the coffee I had brought along and took a sip, its warmth a strange contrast to the chill settling over the room. There it was, the man who had spent years diminishing me, reducing my entire body of work to nothing more than following orders, now standing in the center of his own home while strangers dismantled his empire piece by piece. And the remarkable thing was that I hadn't needed to raise my voice or cause a scene. He had mocked me in front of his peers. He had seen me as decorative at best. Yet when the moment arrived, I had acted quietly, decisively, and now he was watching the walls close in. What my father couldn't comprehend was that a 4-star general had obeyed my words immediately. That obedience had set off a chain of events leading directly to this morning, to this photograph, to the reality that nothing in his life would ever look the same again. I didn't smile. Revenge, at least for me, was never about satisfaction in someone's downfall. It was about balance, about ensuring that scales, once tipped, were righted again. And as the lead agent slid the photograph back into its sleeve, something else became clear to me. This wasn't the conclusion. It was only the opening of a story I had never intended to tell. I wish I could say my father's contempt for the military grew from ignorance. It didn't. It came from conviction. In his mind, the only battles worth fighting were waged in boardrooms over contracts, acquisitions, and market dominance. Success was measured in quarterly earnings and the depth of one's client roster. To him, the uniform I wore represented wasted potential, a declaration that I had chosen servitude over ambition. From as far back as I can remember, he had charted a course for me. Private school to Ivy League, summer internships at his firm, a front-row education in the empire he was constructing so I could absorb its mechanics before inheriting it. He even had a specific timeline for when I would join as a junior associate. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the shape my life was supposed to take. My mother saw things differently. Quiet in public, fierce behind closed doors, she had a way of making me feel that my decisions carried genuine weight. When I told her I wanted to serve, she didn't argue that I was wrong. She asked me why. I told her it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about doing work that felt like it mattered. She listened. She smiled. And for a time, that was enough to cushion me from my father's disappointment. She became my ally in small but essential ways. When my father dismissed my interest in the ROTC program, she was the one who urged me to attend the informational meeting. When he scoffed at the idea of me waking at 5 o'clock in the morning to run drills, she bought me my first proper pair of running shoes. When I signed my enlistment papers, she was the one who came to the swearing-in, seated in the front row, clapping until her palms turned red. That equilibrium, her support on one side, his disapproval on the other, shaped my early years more than I understood at the time. It taught me how to hold my position without raising my voice, how to make choices quietly and stand behind them. But balance doesn't last forever. She died without warning, a heart attack. I was still on my first tour, stationed overseas. The call came in the middle of the night, the kind that leaves you staring at the ceiling long after the voice on the other end has gone quiet. I took emergency leave, flew home, and walked into a house that no longer felt like mine. My father didn't meet me at the airport. He was occupied managing the arrangements. The service was tasteful, expensive, and impersonal. Her entire life condensed into a printed program with her name in gold script. I stood at the podium to speak and felt the weight of his eyes on me. A wordless warning not to make it personal, not to say things he felt didn't belong in a public setting. I said what I needed to say anyway. Within months, he had remarried. She was younger than me by a few years, with perfect hair and a smile that never reached her eyes. Their wedding was held in the same house where my mother used to decorate for Christmas. I wasn't asked to stand beside him. I was seated near the back, introduced to guests as my daughter, the one in the army, as though my presence were a novelty. That was when I understood what my father's inner circle truly meant. It wasn't about family. It was about loyalty to his world. My mother had been my only connection to it. With her gone, the drawbridge had been raised. I wasn't in the room where decisions were made. I wasn't consulted. I wasn't even kept informed. My life and my work were irrelevant unless they could be displayed as an asset in his social theater. The distance between us expanded in ways that couldn't be tracked in miles. Holidays became optional. Phone calls grew rare and brief. He stopped asking about my postings or promotions. I stopped volunteering the information. When we did speak, it was polite and transactional. Beneath the surface lay a mutual understanding that we inhabited separate worlds, and he saw no purpose in constructing a bridge between them. Looking back, I can trace how these patterns hardened in both of us. His conviction that my choices were a rejection of his legacy, my conviction that his approval was something I neither sought nor required. We carried those beliefs like armor, never realizing that one day they would be the very things determining how we faced each other when everything finally came undone. And when that day arrived, it wasn't in a boardroom or on a battlefield. It was at a dinner table beneath a crystal chandelier, with a single sentence meant to diminish me and a single decision that would overturn everything he thought he understood about who I was. I enlisted with a quiet certainty, a calm resolve that even I hadn't anticipated. Basic training stripped away whatever posturing I had carried in. What remained was discipline, a hunger for hard work, and a reflex that moved toward problems rather than away from them. I wasn't the fastest in my platoon. I learned to execute small tasks correctly until the larger ones trusted me with themselves. When the commissioning board offered a path forward, I took it. The Army gave me languages. It gave me the map of places I had traced with a finger on paper as a child. Afghanistan taught me patience and precision. My first deployment began in a valley where radios failed every afternoon because the mountains swallowed our signal. We learned to move by timing and by trust. I managed air deconfliction for a mixed convoy after a rock slide severed the only road. The decision window was measured in heartbeats. No one cheered when we came through. We counted supplies, signed a log, and slept in shifts. At dawn, I sketched altitudes and routes, logging winds and rehearsing contingencies until they became muscle memory. The second tour dissolved my illusions about intelligence work. It is a corridor of maybe, a ledger of penciled clues, a shifting circle of names until one pattern holds. My team pulled threads from market chatter and diesel receipts. We located a storage cache that didn't match the manifests. We passed the finding up the chain with the caveat every good analyst learns to carry. A patrol avoided an ambush because of that memo. A week later, a report arrived in 3 lines. It didn't name me. It meant someone got to go home. Promotions followed in the slow way that feels like bedrock. I accepted each pin with a short nod. I sent my mother's favorite words to myself in a private email I never shared. Do the work. Be where it counts. Calls with my father had thinned to weather and taxes. When he mentioned my career, he wore a polished half-smile. Medals are nice, Joanna. They mean nothing in the real world. He believed the real world lived in glass towers and corner offices. My real world fit inside a rucksack and a notebook. Later, it fit inside a hard case with a sat phone and spare batteries. Africa expanded it further. I learned the smell of a runway at noon and the weight of a generator at midnight. Floods severed the ground route to a clinic. Roads became rivers. Rumors swelled about theft at a supply depot. I sat with a local chief and a regional medic beneath a tin roof while rain hammered corrugated metal. We redrew the plan and moved supplies by helicopter in 2 lifts. Commendations arrived with the same quietness as the work that earned them. A ribbon pinned in a crowded room. A letter naming 3 actions before shifting to budget notes. A handshake from a colonel who favored brevity over ceremony. I kept the citations in a slim folder at the back of a drawer. On nights when the power flickered, I took them out, not to feel important, but to reread the small errors I still wanted to correct. The habit protected me from both pride and despair. I learned to receive praise as data. I learned to measure myself by outcomes rather than applause. Distance doesn't only grow across oceans. It grows in the pauses between sentences. When I flew home during brief windows, my father introduced me with a smile that carried a question mark. "This is my daughter. She is in the Army." It sounded like a footnote. He asked about exit strategies and transferable skills. I answered politely. I didn't hand him my stories. I kept them where they belonged, inside the people who had lived them. Some lessons harden into something you can feel in your palm. Be where you're needed. Act without seeking credit. Leave things better than you found them. I didn't design that as a philosophy. It became one. Command noticed. Teams noticed. General Marcus Hale noticed. Long before the night at my father's dinner, he had watched me step in for an absent captain without announcement. He had watched me close a loose end before signing my name. Trust is not a speech. It is a ledger. Mine wasn't flashy. It was line after line of quiet completion. That is why, when his phone illuminated beneath the chandelier and my message appeared, he didn't hesitate for a single moment. He stood, he left, he lived. And I learned once again the only rule that has never failed me. Show up when it matters. Let the work speak. Walk away without looking back. It was a week before the dinner when my father called. That alone was unusual. We weren't in the habit of speaking without a clear reason. His voice was smooth and rehearsed, the same register he used when addressing potential clients. "Joanna," he said, as though testing the syllables for the first time in months. "There's a very important business dinner next Friday. I want you there." The words dropped like a stone into still water, ripples of suspicion spreading outward. My father never included me in gatherings like this. The last time I had attended one of his corporate events was years prior, seated at the far end of a long table, introduced in passing and promptly forgotten by the people who counted in his world. "Why?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "You are my daughter. It is important for certain people to meet you." The pause that followed was deliberate. It would mean something. He didn't specify what it would mean or to whom. I knew better than to expect details. Part of me wanted to decline. I had enough demanding my attention. A new assignment had just landed on my desk, and I was still finishing after-action reports from my last field rotation. But something in his voice, a carefully calculated blend of pride and necessity, made me pause. There was an undercurrent I couldn't quite read. "All right," I said finally. "I'll be there." I told myself it was a social obligation, a way to maintain the fragile peace between us. You can attend one dinner, sit through the stories, smile politely, and walk away unchanged. That was the agreement I made with myself. The evening arrived with winter air sharp enough to sting. My father's driver met me at the curb outside my apartment, holding the door open with a nod. The car's interior carried a faint scent of leather and cedar, and the city slid past the tinted windows in streaks of light. The private club was tucked behind a row of unmarked facades on a narrow street, where the traffic seemed to quiet itself. From the outside, it was all restraint, brass handles, no signage. Inside, the world shifted. The entryway opened into a hall paneled in dark wood, polished to a sheen that mirrored the low amber lighting. Oil paintings lined the walls. Not generic landscapes, but portraits of men in tailored suits and women in gowns, each rendered with such precision you could almost hear the rustle of fabric. Their eyes appeared to follow you, a silent committee assessing your worthiness to venture further in. A hostess in a black dress greeted us with a smile that was trained rather than spontaneous, her voice soft enough to make you lean in. "Right this way, Mr. Reed. Your table is prepared." The carpet was thick enough to absorb the sound of footsteps entirely. Staff moved with economy, balancing trays of crystal glasses and silver cutlery. The scent in the air was a careful composition, something floral layered over something darker, perhaps tobacco, engineered to make you feel both welcomed and slightly on guard. We passed a library room on the left, its walls lined with leather-bound books, spines stamped in gold. A fire crackled in the hearth, though no one sat near it. On the right, a small bar gleamed under recessed lighting, bottles arranged like trophies. The dining room itself was a study in opulence. Long tables draped in white linen, each laid with place cards in elegant script. The chairs were high-backed, upholstered in deep burgundy, the kind that compelled you to sit straighter. Overhead, chandeliers hung low enough to catch every glint of glassware. My father moved ahead of me, nodding to acquaintances, offering handshakes with the kind of grip that lingered just long enough to signal control. I followed, the sound of my heels muffled by the carpet, absorbing the way the room appeared to hum with understated competition. Every gesture, every glance was a transaction. He stopped at a table near the center of the room, one of the best positions for visibility. "You'll sit here," he said, drawing out a chair. His tone made plain it wasn't courtesy. It was placement. As I settled in, I scanned the room, noting clusters of conversation, the quick assessments people made of one another. I reminded myself why I was here, an evening of polite endurance, nothing more. Yet there was a tightness in my chest, a sense that this was not simply a dinner. It felt more like the opening move in a game I hadn't agreed to play. And somewhere in the depths of my instincts, a voice I had learned to trust whispered that I would need to pay close attention. This night would not pass quietly. The longer I remained at the table, the more the patterns became visible. Every burst of laughter was slightly too measured. Every handshake held a fraction too long. It was the kind of room where everyone worked to read everyone else without appearing to try. Several faces I recognized from financial magazines and political broadcasts. But there were others, faces that meant nothing in a social context, yet carried a particular gravity. They wore expressions that didn't match their voices. Their eyes swept the room in calculated passes, settling on each person as though assigning a value. When my father began introducing me to his guests, his tone was cool, almost perfunctory. "This is my daughter Joanna. She is in the Army." He delivered it the way someone might mention a relative who collects stamps, an interesting but ultimately irrelevant detail. There was no mention of my rank, my service, or the places I had been. To him, the only relevant fact was the uniform, and even that he offered as an afterthought. I extended my hand, offered a polite smile, received nods in return. The small talk was predictable. "How long have you served? Do you plan to make a career of it?" No one asked what I actually did or why I served. Still, I made a habit of listening more than speaking. Years in the field had taught me that conversations are rarely about the words exchanged. They're about the words people choose not to say. Between the stock questions and the laughter, I caught hints of guarded subjects, deals not yet public, alliances being carefully weighed. Halfway through a round of introductions, my father was called away to greet a late arrival. I found myself standing beside a man in a charcoal suit, his cufflinks catching the light with every subtle movement. He leaned slightly toward me, his voice pitched low enough not to carry. "Do you know who that is?" he asked, his chin lifting just enough to indicate someone across the room. I followed his line of sight. The man in question stood alone near the service entrance. Tall, lean, postured deceptively relaxed. I didn't need to look twice. 2 years earlier, his photograph had been taped to the inside of a briefing folder inkable. I had memorized it the way you memorize the look of a gathering storm, because recognizing it might give you a fighting chance to survive it. A contract assassin connected to 3 confirmed kills across 3 continents. Interpol had issued a red notice, but he had vanished before anyone could act. I felt my shoulders tighten, though my expression held. "I know," I said quietly. The man beside me appeared to take my answer as a signal to say nothing further. He gave a single nod, then turned back to the group conversation as though our exchange had never taken place. I remained where I was, observing the assassin without staring. He was engaged with one of the servers, but his attention kept drifting toward the center of the room, toward a specific table where my father's most prominent guest was seated. That was when I registered who had caught his eye. General Marcus Hale, 4 stars, Army Chief of Staff. Hale was mid-conversation, his back partially toward the assassin. From where I stood, The line of sight was unobstructed. My instincts began slotting the pieces together. The timing, the positioning, the mere fact that a man on Interpol's most wanted list was present at all. Nothing in the room had changed for anyone else. Laughter still rose and fell. Cutlery still chimed against plates. But for me, the edges of the evening had sharpened. I could feel the current running beneath the surface now. The one telling me this night was not going to conclude the way anyone had planned. I shifted slightly in my chair, enough to angle my view without attracting notice. My father was still talking, entirely oblivious to the change in the air. Whatever his reason for including me tonight, I was beginning to suspect it was not the complete story. And whether he understood it or not, there was far more at stake here than his reputation or his business dealings. I set my water glass down, hand steady. One thing the Army had taught me above all else: you never dismiss a face you've been trained to remember, and you never assume a crowded room will protect you. The dinner was in full swing when my father launched into one of his stories. He always told them the same way, slow enough to command the table, laced with just enough detail to make people lean in, always closing with a line that functioned simultaneously as a punchline and a lesson. People who build something real, he said, gesturing with his glass, understand that money is made in the arena, not in the bleachers, not on a government salary. His eyes flicked toward me just long enough for the meaning to register. Real money, real success. None of it comes from following orders and collecting a paycheck from the taxpayers. A wave of polite laughter moved around the table. I held my expression steady, my gaze fixed on the rim of my water glass. Years of uniform inspections and mission briefings had trained me to maintain my composure even when the air grew heavy. If I let the words sink in, they would only cut deeper. Instead, I let my eyes move across the room, mapping it the way I would a new operating environment. Who was standing with whom? Who avoided whose gaze? The staff moved in precise lines between tables, refilling glasses without disrupting conversations. And then I saw him again. Near the far wall, partially hidden by the curve of a pillar, stood the man I had noticed earlier, the assassin. He wasn't socializing, wasn't performing any pretense of belonging to the event. He was watching. This time I tracked his line of sight and felt my stomach tighten. General Marcus Hale was standing less than 15 feet away, speaking to the senator I'd seen him with earlier. The chandelier light caught the silver of his hair and the polished edge of his insignia. His posture was open, his full attention on his companion. The assassin's attention was entirely on him. My pulse quickened, but I forced my breathing to remain controlled. Outwardly, I gave no indication that I had noticed anything at all. Inwardly, my mind was already working through options. Hale's aides were nowhere in the immediate vicinity. The general was unaware of the eyes fixed on him, and this was not the kind of place where anyone anticipated danger. That made it considerably worse. I shifted slightly in my chair, just enough to adjust my angle without drawing attention. My father was still talking, wrapping his story toward a flourish about the risks only true leaders are willing to take. The table responded with another wave of laughter. I kept my eyes on the assassin. He moved only enough to avoid blocking a passing server, then resumed his position, sweeping the crowd but always returning to Hale. I could read it in his stance, weight evenly distributed, one shoulder turned slightly, that he was trained. This wasn't curiosity. This was surveillance with intention. And there, at the center of that polished, glittering room, beneath the hum of business deals and social maneuvering, I understood that the evening had fundamentally changed. I glanced toward my father. He was basking in his audience's attention, entirely unaware of the quiet threat just yards away. I wondered, not for the first time, whether he would even believe me if I told him. I didn't move yet. Acting too early could be as dangerous as acting too late. Timing was everything. In the Army, we call it waiting for the window, those few seconds when action has the greatest chance of succeeding. The laughter at our table was fading as a waiter arrived with the next course. Silver domes lifted in unison, releasing the scent of seared meat and rosemary. My father reached for his knife, redirecting his focus to his plate. I allowed myself one final look at the assassin. His gaze had narrowed, his focus honed, like a lens locking onto a subject. The room still didn't know. Hale still didn't know, but I did. And I knew this. When the window opened, I would be prepared. The window opened in a single breath. I took it. I slid my phone from my clutch, held it beneath the linen, and opened the secure thread built for emergencies no one could predict and no one could dismiss. My thumbs were steady. The message had to be simple. Get up and leave. Now. Don't ask why. I pressed send. The screen dimmed. The phone disappeared under the fold of the tablecloth. My face remained impassive. I lifted my water glass as though nothing had shifted. Across the room, General Marcus Hale paused mid-sentence. His hand moved to his inner pocket. He glanced down without breaking his posture. Our eyes connected for a single heartbeat. Acknowledgement, trust, movement. He rose from his chair. "Senator, we'll finish this tomorrow," he said. His tone was even and unhurried. He buttoned his jacket and turned toward the corridor that led past the bar. Conversations didn't stop. They thinned. A four-star general was departing before the main course. My father's fork hovered above his plate. "What is that about?" he asked under his breath. I cut a small piece of meat and didn't answer. The assassin pushed off the wall with quiet purpose. He angled toward the corridor on an intercept line. His expression was blank. His footfalls were like water on tile. Then the aides appeared. I hadn't seen where they came from. That was the point. One moved to shadow the general's shoulder. The other approached from the side with the unhurried ease of a man heading toward the restroom. The assassin adjusted half a step. The corridor narrowed. Geometry turned against him. My father attempted a laugh. It came out thin. "Leaving early. Even generals have bedtimes," he said. No one responded. I touched my napkin and tracked the corridor with peripheral vision. The first aide greeted the assassin as though they were acquaintances. The second shifted to block the exit with a courteous sidestep. Hill never broke stride. He turned the corner and was gone. A current moved through the dining room, the kind you feel rather than see. In the corridor, a quiet exchange hardened. The assassin angled away. The aides moved with him, every gesture polished, every inch deliberate. 3 figures paused near the service door. A fourth arrived from the kitchen hall. A manager mentioned a private call. The door opened, the door closed, the corridor emptied. Most people registered only courtesy and logistics. They noticed the absence of a powerful man and the return of calm. To them, the evening had resumed. To me, the wiring of the night had been permanently altered. My father leaned closer. "Did you say something to him?" he asked. The question was a knife wrapped in velvet. I let steam blur the edge of my vision. I offered a small shrug. He remembered something. That is all. Across the room, the senator checked his watch. The hostess lifted a phone. 2 security staff who hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier stood in the oval of shadow cast by a nearby painting. The assassin was gone. The aides were gone. Tension bled from the air. My pulse slowed. I forced my breathing into cadence. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. I swallowed water that tasted of nothing. The trick to a silent move is not the action itself. It is the denial afterward. Deny the spike, its echo, and people convinced themselves there was never a spike at all. The room obliged. Volume returned. Jokes resumed. Deals rekindled their threads. My father raised his glass in a small toast. "To leaders who understand the value of staying in the room," he said. His gaze touched mine for an instant. He wanted me to flinch. I didn't. I set my fork down. I folded my hands. I let the wave pass. In the quiet that followed, one fact settled into place. A single text had moved a 4-star general. A single decision had rebalanced the night. No announcement, no applause. Only a quiet pivot that kept the wrong man from reaching the right target. That was enough. Later, my father reassembled the scaffolding of charm. He resumed the story he had interrupted. People laughed on cue. Every so often his eyes drifted toward the corridor and back to me, as though he could detect an echo he preferred to ignore. I kept my expression mild and asked the waiter for coffee. The cup arrived hot. It tasted steady and clean. The room chose to forget. I did not. The window had closed. The calculus had shifted. The rest of the night would follow the track I had set, without anyone noticing the rail had been moved. Beneath the chandelier, I understood that the storm had been delayed, not canceled. Morning would bring the proof. The knock came just after sunrise. Not a neighbor's tap, not the casual rhythm of a delivery. It was the kind of knock that settled in your chest. 3 sharp bursts, a pause, then 3 more. I was already dressed. Sleep had been shallow, my mind replaying the movements of the previous night. The corridor, the aides, the way the assassin's focus had locked onto Marcus Hale. I walked to the porch with coffee in hand, steam curling into the cold morning air. From the top step, I could see them. Black SUVs lined along the curb, doors open, engines idling. Men and women in dark jackets moved out with quick, synchronized efficiency. Interpol was printed in white on their backs. They didn't waste time with introductions. The front gate swung open. The sound of boots on stone echoed across the driveway. I stayed where I was and let the scene unfold without inserting myself into it. The front door opened and my father appeared in the frame. He wore a robe, hair uncombed, his expression suspended somewhere between irritation and confusion. He began to speak, but the lead agent stepped forward with a leather folder in hand. "Mr. Reed," the agent said. His voice was calm and clipped, every syllable precise. He opened the folder, drew out a photograph, and held it up. My father's eyes dropped to the image. Whatever remained of his morning composure fell with them. His mouth opened, but no sound came. His shoulders dipped, as though the weight of the paper were pressing on him from a distance. I already knew what it showed before I saw its angle. It was him standing in a narrow corridor, clasping hands with the man from the previous night, the assassin I had identified the instant I spotted him at the club. The background was unmistakable. Same wall paneling, same brass light fixtures. The agent offered no further elaboration. He didn't need to. Behind him, the rest of the team began their sweep. 2 agents went upstairs. Another disappeared toward the kitchen. Radios crackled in brief bursts. Evidence bags emerged from pockets. Drawers opened and shut with methodical efficiency. The entire house was being disassembled layer by layer. I leaned against the porch railing and took a sip of coffee. The taste was bitter and grounding. From where I stood, I could hear the cadence of the agents' movements, the way their boots struck the hardwood in unison. They weren't there to search. They were there to clear. My father finally found his voice. "What is this? What are you doing in my home?" The words were directed at the lead agent, but they wavered. He was reaching for authority, and it kept sliding away. The agent's gaze didn't shift. "We have additional materials, but I believe this image is sufficient for now." He returned the photo to its sleeve and placed it back in the folder. I watched my father's eyes flick almost involuntarily toward where I stood, just for a second. And in that second, a tangle of emotions crossed his face. Recognition, accusation, and something else I couldn't name. I didn't move. The operation inside continued. A laptop was carried down the stairs, cables still trailing. A locked case from his study was opened, its contents photographed before being sealed into evidence bags. Outside, the neighborhood was stirring. Curtains shifted in nearby windows. Someone's dog barked twice and fell silent. The air carried a faint trace of frost and exhaust. I thought about the night before, about how swiftly everything had unraveled. One text, one movement, and by morning the threads had come this far apart. When the agents began filing out with their secured items, the lead paused at the threshold. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Reed," he said. It wasn't a courtesy. It was a statement of fact. My father stood rooted in place, the robe's belt hanging loose, his face pale beneath the early light. From the porch, I finished my coffee, set the empty cup on the railing, and stepped down to the walkway. Passing him, I caught the faintest trace of the cologne he always wore to meetings. It smelled the same. The man wearing it didn't. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The photograph had already said what needed saying. The rest of the day would take care of the rest. He spoke first. The front door was still standing open. Cold air moved through the hall. The last agent crossed the threshold. My father turned toward me, wearing the face I recognized from press photographs. The expression he put on when a deal slipped away. His voice, however, didn't match. It shook. "What did you do?" "Not me," I said. "You did this." The words hung between us like a tape line stretched across a doorway. He studied my face, searching for a clause he could negotiate. I offered none. He tried again, softer, the tone he reserved for juries he was trying to guide. Joanna, be reasonable. This is a misunderstanding. Someone made a mistake. They showed you a photograph, I said. They didn't bring rumors. They brought proof. He flinched as though I had laid a hand on him. You think a handshake constitutes a conspiracy? That man could have engineered the greeting. People do that. They stage a photograph. They manufacture a lie. This is my house. This is my life. I kept my voice level. You invited me to a dinner where a 4-star general was present. A known contract killer was also present. Interpol does not execute a warrant because someone brushed your hand in a corridor. He stared past me at the street, as though the morning might offer him a better answer. The silence stretched. Finally, he reached for the argument he used in other emergencies. Family does not do this to family. Family does not hire killers, I said. Family does not launder money through shell companies. Family does not gamble with a life that isn't theirs. His shoulders rose and fell. Then the strategist returned, the man who treated pressure as atmosphere. He stepped closer, the robe brushing the tile. If you said something to that general, undo it. You still have time. Tell them it was a mistake. Say you misread a face in a crowded room. You want me to recant what I observed with trained eyes. I said, you want me to lie so a version of events you prefer can survive. The front gate clicked shut. The house sounded hollow without the confidence that used to occupy it. I am your father, he said. You owe me loyalty. I owe the living the chance to remain alive, I said. I owe the uniform the truth. I owe myself the quiet that comes when I act on what I know. He looked at me the way men look at a verdict they cannot appeal. You have always judged me, he said. You chose a life that repudiates mine. I chose a life that doesn't require applause to be real, I said. The confrontation didn't end at the door. By afternoon, the calls had begun. A cousin wanted to know whether I had turned against my own blood. An old classmate sent a single word, hero, followed by a question mark. A colleague texted 3 words, you did right. A talk radio host framed the story as loyalty versus law. Callers divided in equal measure. Online strangers chose sides. Some said I had betrayed family. Others said I had saved a life. Both claimed the moral high ground. The agents returned for a brief follow-up. My father refused to sit. He paced the foyer and demanded names. He raised questions about jurisdiction. The lead agent repeated the phrase cross-border predicate offenses and said nothing further. When they left, the house felt smaller, as though the walls had drawn inward. That evening, he tried a different approach. He spoke about appearances. He warned me about headlines. He predicted ruin, not only for himself, but for me. Think about your record, he said. Think about what this does to your career. My record is built on showing up when it counts, I said. Today counted. Dusk pulled the color from the windows. The rooms took on that museum quality they always carried, beautiful and uninhabited. I stood to leave. He reached out as if to stop me, then let his hand fall. For a moment, his voice softened. Tell me there's a way back. There's always a way back, I said. It begins with the truth. He didn't answer. I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me. The air felt clean. I saw my reflection in the glass and the outline of the house beyond it. I walked to the gate and didn't look back because some decisions only hold if you keep moving forward. Behind me, the house settled into silence. Ahead of me, the street felt open. My path belonged to me. The investigation moved faster than I had anticipated. By the end of the first week, Interpol and the Domestic Task Force had connected my father to a sequence of transactions distributed across 4 countries. The pattern was visible to anyone who knew where to look. Payments routed through shell corporations, layered transfers that bounced between banks and jurisdictions known for secrecy, and investments disguised as consulting fees. The reports were clinical. Each entry was a date, a sum, a movement from one account to another. But I could see the shape of it forming like a map sketched in reverse. They were following the money back to its source, peeling away the layers he had constructed to make it appear legitimate. One of the investigators, a woman with a measured voice and eyes that missed nothing, explained that the funds had been washed through boutique investment firms. These weren't large, prominent institutions. They were quiet operations, the kind you knew about only if someone extended an invitation. They advertised high returns for select clients and left behind paperwork that looked flawless until you examined the signatures. I sat at the back of the briefing room while she spoke, absorbing the numbers on the screen. The amounts varied, sometimes just enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts, other times bold enough to suggest confidence in the cover. What they all shared was that they moved in a circle, always returning to accounts traceable to someone within my father's orbit. It was strange sitting there knowing that the man under discussion was the same man who had once lectured me about paying credit card bills on time. In his world, appearances were paramount, and he had constructed a version of himself that could pass any surface inspection. That was when the memories began to align. I remembered coming home on leave a few years prior, walking into his study to drop off a folder he had requested. He was on the phone, speaking in the clipped tone he used when he preferred not to be overheard. "The plan is still on track," he said. "No, I'm not concerned about the timing." At the time, I assumed it was a business matter, perhaps a merger or a property transaction. His work had always been filled with terminology I didn't follow closely. He had waved me off with a nod, covering the receiver with his palm until I left the room. Another time, I caught part of a conversation while passing his office door. "We'll move it before the quarter ends," he said, then paused to listen. "No, they won't notice. Not if we do it correctly." Again, I told myself it was the language of commerce, risk management, strategy, the kind of talk that had nothing to do with me. Now, in the context of what the investigators were presenting, those fragments read entirely differently. They weren't harmless negotiations. They were checkpoints in a chain of illegal movements, each one dressed as something legitimate. The agent advanced to another slide, an organizational chart mapping the entities involved. My father's name didn't appear at the top. It never would. But the connections radiated toward him through a network of associates, some of whom I recognized from the dinner, others from photographs in old business publications. They were careful. No single person managed more than one step in the chain. The money moved like a relay, passed from hand to hand before disappearing into an account under a different name. It was a system engineered for deniability. Yet patterns cast a shadow, and shadows leave a trail. As the presentation concluded, the lead investigator made clear that the evidence wasn't merely circumstantial. There were signed documents, recorded calls, and emails that, while vague in their language, precisely matched the timing of the transfers. Every piece was being cross-referenced with surveillance from the night of the dinner. I kept my questions to myself. It wasn't my role to direct their work, but I couldn't ignore the thread running through all of it. My father's compulsion to control outcomes. Whether it was a corporate acquisition or a criminal enterprise, he treated it as a chess match, confident that he could move the pieces without anyone seeing the complete board. Walking out of the briefing, I thought again about those phone calls, about how readily I had accepted his explanations or simply hadn't pressed for any at all. In my work, I was trained to identify connections others overlooked. But with him, I had allowed familiarity to dull my instincts. That wouldn't happen again. The photograph was only the beginning. What the files revealed in the weeks that followed told a story more complicated than simple greed. In the second week, the task force briefed me in a plain room that smelled of dry erase markers and stale coffee. The lead investigator traced a trajectory of pressure. My father had not simply chased profit. He had accepted money to fill a gap that should never have existed, and then discovered that the source wasn't a lender at all. The name on the slide was redacted, but the outline was unmistakable. A financier with diplomatic cover, a patron of the arts in public, a broker of violence in private. Years earlier, a client of my father's firm had imploded under fraud allegations. Settlements loomed. The capital line tightened. Pride prevented any admission of vulnerability. A discreet facility appeared, a bridge loan with generous terms. Then the terms changed. Interest became leverage. Leverage became control. By the time my mother died, the debt had expanded into obligation. The financier used galas and policy forums as hunting grounds, accumulating proximity to power and building a portfolio of leverage. According to emails the agents recovered, my father had stalled several demands. He delayed introductions. He sent small payments as signals that he remained cooperative. The pattern held until the request that intersected my life: arrange access to the senator and to General Hale. I asked the investigator whether my father had known that violence was on the table. She paused, then answered carefully. He may not have known the method. He could not have missed the possibility. The financier had a history of deploying contractors when leverage failed. The assassin's travel matched the patron's itinerary across 2 previous events on 2 separate continents. The dots didn't require imagination. They required the honesty to name what power does when it is cornered. Shame is a poor architect. It builds rooms without exits. Looking back, I recalled gestures that had never fit a clean explanation. A call my father made after midnight one winter, his voice raw: "Leave her out of this. She is not leverage." A donation to a security foundation filed under a friend's name. A foundation that later funded protective training for a judge who had ruled against the patron's ally. At the time, I had assumed he was performing virtue. Now I saw a man pushing back without identifying the danger, hoping that half measures could hold it at bay. The agents found bank drafts covering the tuition of a paralegal's son, the paralegal who managed travel arrangements for the patron's executive assistant. They found a second phone in my father's office safe with a scheduling app protected behind a simple code. The calendar listed charity luncheons and 2 funerals. Beneath each entry sat a 2-letter tag that corresponded to wire transfers routed through art brokers. It was elegant in the way that rot appears elegant at a distance, tidy columns masking the decay beneath. I would like to say the discovery softened me. It didn't. It complicated me. I could hold 2 truths simultaneously. He had broken a law. He had also attempted, through dishonest means, to limit the harm. Those efforts didn't absolve him. They mapped the dimensions of the trap. He had stepped into it with arrogance and remained inside it with fear. The leash tightened each time he pretended it was a necklace. One afternoon, the prosecutor asked whether I would consider providing a character statement. I told her I would speak to the facts I knew. I would not launder motives. She nodded and closed her folder. On the way out, she mentioned something I hadn't known. Months before the dinner, my father had declined an invitation to a private retreat hosted by the patron. His refusal had earned him a warning dressed as courtesy. The message was simple: pay with money or pay with blood. When agents interviewed staff from the club, a server recalled an unusual instruction from a member of the event team: keep the corridor by the service door clear at 9:20 and don't let the bar cart linger. Another staff member remembered being told to dim the sconces to 50% at 9:15. Small adjustments, precise timing. A room configured to eliminate seconds, the kind of modification that gives a contractor just enough space to act and vanish. I drove home through a light rain that turned the traffic lights into soft halos. My father had once told me that every choice is a ledger, costs on one side, benefits on the other. He believed he could keep the numbers in balance by rearranging columns. The investigation revealed a harsher arithmetic. Some debts collect themselves, and they bring company. At night, I replayed the fragments I had dismissed. His phrase from those old calls returned with a colder meaning: the plan is still on track. I had believed he was referring to a merger. Now I understood he had been attempting to keep wolves from the table without admitting that wolves existed. If there was a seed of something redeemable in him, it lived in that denial. He wanted the danger to remain containable so he wouldn't have to see it. The truth didn't free him. It freed my judgment and, eventually, my mercy. The courthouse smelled of paper and disinfectant, a neutral film intended to scrub away whatever people carried inside. Reporters crowded the front steps, microphones extended, cameras blinking red. I kept my gaze forward. I signed into the witness room. The clock above the door ticked like a metronome. Inside, the gallery filled early. The prosecution table was a small city of binders, tabs marking routes through the evidence. The defense relied on a yellow legal pad and a glass of water. My father sat between two attorneys in Navy suits. He looked at the judge. He looked at the press. He did not look at me. The judge entered. We rose. We sat. The clerk read the case number and charges. Conspiracy to launder money. Guide fraud. Providing material support to a violent contractor. Each count landed with weight. The government called its witnesses. A forensic accountant traced transactions through boutique funds, her measured cadence turning numbers into maps. A manager from the private club explained the floor plan, the service corridor, the instruction to dim the sconces at 9:15. An Interpol agent authenticated the photograph and detailed the chain of custody. The screen filled with timestamps. When my name was called, I walked to the stand with my hands at my sides. The Bible was cool beneath my palm when I took the oath. The prosecutor's notes were spare, her questions precise. State your name and occupation. Major Joanna Reed, United States Army. She asked me to describe the dinner, the tone of the room, the moment I identified the assassin, the secure message I sent to General Hale, what I observed when he stood up, how the aides appeared, how the atmosphere thinned. I answered in plain language, sequence and fact only. When she asked why Hale had trusted a message that offered no explanation, I told the truth. He has watched me show up where I was needed without taking credit. She asked whether my father had been aware of the assassin's presence. I cannot speak to his knowledge, I said. I can speak to what I observed. A 4-star general and a known contractor inside the same space, with a corridor adjusted according to a precise schedule. The defense attorney rose with a measured smile. He asked whether I resented my father's world, whether service had narrowed my perspective, whether training predisposed me to see threats. I kept my tone even. I report. I do not project. I recognized a face I had memorized in Kabul. I acted to remove a target. That was all. He held up the photograph. A handshake can be staged, can it not? A photograph is a moment, I said. The investigation is a pattern. He let the words settle, then moved on. When I stepped down, the gallery stirred. The judge's gavel drew a clean line through the sound. By afternoon, the prosecution rested. The defense called a hospital administrator who spoke of a wing my father had funded, a professor who praised his scholarships, a business partner who described him as a problem solver. Their sincerity didn't erase the ledgers projected on the screen. Then the air shifted. My father leaned toward counsel. He asked to address the court. The judge studied him, then allowed a limited statement. He faced the bench. His voice carried without strain. He didn't pursue sympathy. He described pressure that had become threat, a bridge loan that had become a leash, an evening he believed he could manage. He offered a single line that moved through the room like a current. I tried to keep the wolves off my table by asking them to wait on the porch. The prosecutor returned to the lectern. Had he been asked to facilitate proximity to General Hale? Yes. Had he understood that a contractor might be deployed? A long breath, then one word. Yes. A murmur rolled through the gallery. Cameras tilted. The judge's gavel restored order. Counsel conferred. A plea discussion began in full view. Numbers stayed off the record. Consequences did not. When court recessed, the hallway felt colder than the morning. Reporters called my name. I offered no comment. Outside, the sky held flat winter light. I stood for one count. Then I walked to the sidewalk. My pace even, my face unreadable. The story would be the facts, not my expression, not his. I had answered what I had seen. I had honored my commitment to the uniform and to the part of myself that refuses to trade clarity for comfort. In the quiet after the gavel, I felt the particular clarity that follows hard truth. Whatever came next would belong to the record. My task was simple: keep faith with the facts, with myself, and with service. The judge called for a brief recess. The bailiff's voice cut through the shuffling, and chairs scraped against the polished floor. My father remained seated while his attorneys leaned in close, whispering quickly. He didn't look at them. Instead, for the first time in years, his eyes found mine. The familiar edge and calculated amusement were gone. No smirk, no sharpness, just a long, unguarded look that landed heavier than any sentence could. It wasn't remorse in its open form, but something had shifted. I could see it in the way his shoulders weren't squared for effect, and how he made no attempt to outstare me, as though this were one more of our private contests. There was an absence of performance, as if the energy required to maintain it had finally burned away. When court resumed, his lead counsel stood and announced, "Your Honor, my client wishes to change his plea on several counts." A ripple moved through the gallery. Reporters reached for phones. The prosecutor narrowed her eyes, scanning her notes. The judge raised an eyebrow, but nodded for the defense to continue. My father rose, slowly but steadily, and faced the bench. His voice carried without effort. "On the charges of conspiracy and material support, I plead guilty." The air shifted. He didn't flinch at the sound of pens moving or camera shutters clicking. Then he added, "I do so with the understanding that others who acted under my direction, without knowledge of the full scope, will not be prosecuted." It was a calculated move, but not a purely strategic one. The names he was shielding weren't strangers. Some were long-standing employees. A cousin who had managed the books without knowing where the figures led. Even one of the wait staff from that dinner who had simply been told to keep the lights low. By absorbing the majority of the responsibility, he was severing the cord that might have drawn them into the same current. He didn't mention me, not as a plea for my protection, not as a bargaining chip. But the omission was deliberate. If he had wanted to implicate me, the opportunity was available to him. By reframing my warning to Marcus Hale, by suggesting I had acted outside sanctioned authority, by offering the defense a theory of collusion. He didn't. And in that room, silence could be as purposeful as speech. The prosecutor conferred with her team, then addressed the judge. "We will honor the agreement, provided the defendant's cooperation is complete and verifiable." My father gave a single nod. There was no triumph in it, only acceptance. I sat in the witness row watching the man who had built an entire life on never conceding anything stand in open court and acknowledge acts that would strip him of control, liberty, and reputation. His tie was still perfectly knotted, but it hung differently now. No longer part of an armor, but a remnant of a role he could no longer sustain. The judge asked whether the plea was made willingly, without coercion. Yes. Was he satisfied with counsel's advice? Yes. Did he understand the consequences? A pause. Then "I do." The gavel made it official. For a moment afterward, there was no sound but the quiet hum of the overhead lights. Then the judge set a date for sentencing. Attorneys gathered their papers. The gallery began to stir again, but I remained still, taking in the rare image of my father not as the man in command, but as a man who had made a choice. One that, for once, did not center on his own survival. He didn't look at me again before the bailiff guided him toward the holding area. I hadn't expected him to. The connection had already occurred in that brief, wordless exchange before the recess, a recognition that required no apology to be genuine. It was the first time he hadn't tried to win. The first time he had allowed a part of himself to be cut away without demanding someone else bear the cost. Walking out of the courthouse, the cold air struck my face like a reset. The press gathered immediately, asking what I thought of his plea. I said nothing. This wasn't about public reaction, not for me. It was about a man who had spent a lifetime dismissing my judgment, finally choosing, in his own way, not to make me collateral damage. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was a decision that left me standing on my own side of the line. And that was enough. Sometimes, in a life like mine, the absence of betrayal can feel as close to redemption as you will ever come. A year had passed since the trial. My days had settled into a steady cadence. Briefings at dawn, operations that carried me into classified spaces, evenings that belonged to my own quiet habits. I hadn't thought much about my father beyond what the news occasionally reported. Inmate transfers, an appeal denied, a health update suggesting he was aging faster behind bars. Then one morning, a plain envelope arrived at my office. No return address, but the handwriting stopped me mid-step. Sharp, deliberate strokes. His handwriting. I turned the envelope over twice before sliding a letter opener along the seam. The paper inside was lined, folded with a precision that was almost military. The first sentence read, I never thought you had that kind of strength." I sat with those words for a long time, the text shifting slightly as sunlight angled across my desk. He had written more, pages of it, in fact. He wrote about the food, the noise, the constant economy of favors that govern prison life. He mentioned books he'd read, faces he had come to recognize, and a certain discipline he was working to maintain. But every few paragraphs, he circled back to me, to that night at the dinner table, to the moment Marcus stood and left on nothing more than my instruction. He asked what had tipped me off, whether I'd been trained to read situations like that, whether someone had forewarned me. And then, as though the questions were smoke thinning in a gust of wind, he admitted something I had never expected to see from him in writing, that a part of him had been glad I acted, even if it had brought the entire architecture of his life down around him. Still, the line that stood apart, framed by white space above and below it, was that first one. "I never thought you had that kind of strength." I folded the letter and slid it back into its envelope. I didn't compose a reply, not out of anger, and not to leave him wondering. I didn't respond because strength, as he named it, wasn't what had moved me that night. It was something older and slower, built over years in the absence of his recognition, something that didn't require his label to exist. Strength implied I had overcome something. What I had actually done was the opposite. I had refused to be drawn into his orbit, refused to allow his choices to determine my safety or the safety of those under my watch. That wasn't about force. That was about trust in my own judgment and in the foundation I had constructed brick by brick when no one else saw fit to pay attention. I placed the envelope in my desk drawer beneath a file that would shield it from plain sight. If I ever read it again, it would be years from now. For the moment, it was enough to know the words existed. As the day moved forward, the letter became just another detail folded into the life I had built without his permission. I returned to the briefing room, my coffee cooling beside the mission map. My colleagues worked through contingencies, and I listened, making notes where I needed to. No one there knew about the envelope in my drawer. They didn't have to. Some truths don't need an audience. Time didn't pause after the letter. It never does. My service continued. My life held its pace. Deployments rotated in and out. Files crossed my desk in coded sequences. I lived alone, not from isolation, but from choice, shaping my own space without the echoes of the past. My father lost everything. The companies, the estates, the thin constellation of people who had once smiled because his name carried weight. There was no satisfaction in watching that unfold. I didn't savor it the way some might expect. What I felt instead was a lightness, a lifting of something I hadn't recognized as a burden until it was gone, something I had been carrying since I was old enough to understand that his world was dangerous. Every so often, the memory of that dinner would surface without invitation. Not the aftermath, not the headlines, but the single moment Marcus stood and walked away without asking why. That was the real evidence, the quiet proof that I didn't need my father's acknowledgement to be heard, to be trusted. I had constructed that trust entirely on my own. It became a private touchstone I carried forward, one moment, one movement, confirming that I could navigate crisis without waiting for anyone to grant me authority. The people who mattered listened. That was sufficient. The seasons turned and life continued unfolding. My work carried me to places I cannot name and introduced me to people I would never encounter again after the mission closed. But in the early hours, when the city was quiet and the sky just beginning to pale, I would occasionally think about how quickly that moment at the table had come and gone, and how permanent its impression had been. If you had told me years ago that my resolution with my father wouldn't arrive through conversation or apology, I might have doubted you. But closure had come in fragments. The shift in his eyes before the plea, the silence where he could have pulled me down with him, the letter he sent a year later. None of those things constituted redemption on their own. Together, however, they formed something close enough to allow me to let go. I don't live waiting for reconciliation anymore. I don't measure my worth against the gaps in someone else's approval. I measure it by the lives I protect, the integrity I refuse to surrender, and the moments when the people I trust act without hesitation because they know I would never lead them into harm. As for my father, I don't know whether I'll see him again. The future has a way of folding unexpected meetings into itself, but I won't plan for it. If it happens, I'll be ready. If it doesn't, I already have everything I need. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read every one with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this one, but to become part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. I know that now, and that's why the last words I'll leave you with are simple, the same ones I live by every day. I choose my ground, and I stand.